Thank you, Yitzhak. First of all, thanks to Yitzhak and everyone else for being here and for extending the invitation. I think I have a particularly tough task in following Chaim's presentation from last week. But rather than do anything other than present what I want to present, hopefully everyone feels free to ask whatever questions you want to ask, and somehow it'll all tie in with some continuity to what we've been hearing the last few weeks. So for me personally, in terms of philosophical inquiry, it's always been difficult to kind of pick up where people are historically. I studied political science, so of course at the 100 level we had to read Marx. Now, to me, you can't understand Marx if you don't study Feuerbach and Hegel. So even though Feuerbach and Hegel were just barely on the syllabus, I had to delve into Feuerbach and Hegel in order to try to understand Marx. So of course I'm already, 2 or 3 years behind the rest of the freshman class because I'm trying to go over to Feuerbach and Hegel. Ultimately, for me, everything went back to Heraclitus and Parmenides. These are two ancient Greek philosophers, approximately 2,500 years ago. And the gist for them is, for Heraclitus, everything is change. You can't step in the same stream twice. So, as the river moves through life, and as you move through life, even if you pick the exact same geographical, physical spot in the stream to step into it, the second time everything is different. For Parmenides, everything is constant. So that's a little bit by way of background. The other bit of background I want to offer is that language is always a part of the problem when trying to understand these concepts. Jeśli ja teraz będę mówił po polsku, kto będzie mnie rozumiał? Jeden? Po ruski to nie jest po polsku. Po żydowsku to nie jest po polsku. Okay, so when you're used to hearing and understanding things in a particular language, any other language doesn't do the same thing for you. For everybody in here who's polyglot or at least bilingual, you understand that concept. There are certain concepts in any given language that don't translate absolutely perfectly to another language. There are also rules of syntax and grammar that don't stay consistent between languages. In English, for instance, we don't have declensions that are as complicated and complex that everything is broken down into masculine, feminine, or neuter, whereas in other languages you do. In English, you have essentially states of being and verb conjugation. You don't have states of becoming so much. It's a very complicated structure to be able to write a paragraph well in English and try to convey a state of becoming rather than state of being. Whereas in Spanish and Hebrew, it's much easier to do that. Those are natural verb conjugations in those languages. So there's this thing called linguistic relativity and the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. And some people would say that that hypothesis has been disproven, and certainly in its most extreme incarnations, it's dubious. But I think there's a lot to it. If you watch kids on the playground, let's say on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, in Central Park and Riverside Park, pre-verbal children, okay, you could have a Palestinian kid and an Israeli kid playing on the same slide, on the same swing set, on the same equipment. And as long as they're both pretty cool and laid-back kids, they're going to vibe with one another. They're not going to discuss the right of return or religion or politics or geography. They're going to vibe with one another. Tamils and Hindus. You can pick any spot on the globe where there's a conflict, whether it's ethnic, whether it's religious, whatever the case may be, racial, and that does not necessarily manifest itself in New York City, where you have people from these dramatically different backgrounds living side by side, or living in the same neighborhoods where at least the kids get to play side by side as long as the parents don't get involved. So what I get out of this is that essentially pre-verbal children live in a kind of neurochemical cognitive soup that allows them to just read vibes. Are mommy or daddy anxious? Or mommy or daddy happy? Am I feeling love, warm fuzzies? Am I feeling anxiety? It's all about the feelings. And what I want to suppose is that that's actually reality. That's reality before we're born. That's potentially reality after we die. That's certainly reality before we become verbal. And everything that happens after we learn language, that's the illusion. That's language being used as a structure that imprints our neural cognitive pathways by the rules of the language. And that's essentially linguistic relativity. Now, if you want to think in terms of people throughout history who have made inquiries in these directions, Hermann Hesse comes to mind, for instance, the author of Siddhartha, Steppenwolf, Damien, a number of books. The guy spent a good deal of time in and out of lunatic asylums in Switzerland. If you think of Robert Pirsig, who wrote Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, and followed that up with Lila or Lila, I'm not sure what the pronunciation is supposed to be, an inquiry into morals. He was a philosophy student at the University of Chicago and ultimately had a nervous breakdown. If you look at musicians, visual artists, lots of different artists, oftentimes they rely on forms of communication that are not verbal. It's the music, it's the painting, it's the sculpture, it's all these different ways to convey feelings, concepts, anxieties. If you think of Munch's painting, The Scream, which I think is one of the best visual symbols of the horrors of the 20th century. It's a perfect example. That painting speaks cross-culturally and cross-linguistically as a visual symbol of what it is that the author, the artist, wants to convey. Another play on that, for instance, is Magritte, with the painting of a pipe. And the text below that painting, "C'est nous un pipe." If anybody knows French, they can probably correct my pronunciation. This is not a pipe. Okay, so if the words weren't there and you saw a painting of a pipe the way you see a painting of a still life of a plate of fruit, for instance, what happens cognitively is your brain reads that visual symbol and you have an idea based on that. But he wants to invert that. He's transgressive. He's changing the borders, or he's violating the borders as he's trying to move the boundaries, expand the envelope cognitively by putting immediately under that visual cue, this is not a pipe. Even though it looks to you like a pipe, that's not what the painting is. So I'm not going to go over the whole list here of people who I think have struggled with this boundary, this border, which in some ways defines that really thin line between madness and genius. I'm just going to name one, Amy Winehouse, for instance, who we just lost recently. An incredible musical talent, a very young woman who died at the same exact age as lots of other people, musicians, Cobain, Joplin, Morrison, Hendrix. So there's something to this age, this late 20s, having made it as an artist, having used music as your vehicle through which you convey these emotions rather than speaking specifically in language about them, and struggling with it. So the point of this bit of background that I want to offer is that socialization and language wind up limiting our consciousness. So trying to break through the boundaries, trying to expand those limits through the use of language is problematic. These are concepts which in a lot of ways either you feel it in your kishkas, or you don't. And everybody has to experience them, pardon? In your kishkas.
Under God's.
What'd you think I said? Maybe I don't want to know. Everybody has to experience it individually. Everybody has to experience it for themselves. You cannot put in language and convey some of these concepts to other people. Either you experience it or you don't. And now, for me, some of this actually goes back to the Zohar, Kabbalah, that what we perceive through our senses as reality is actually behind a veil, behind a curtain. It's not truly reality. Our sensory perception is limited for the sake of our sanity. That if we stayed in that kind of pre-verbal cognitive soup that children live in, we wouldn't be able to deal with any kind of adult life. We wouldn't be able to deal with one another in any kind of constructive way. And if any of this sounds a little too crazy, a little too mad, that's fine. But I want to cite Alfred Koszybski, who came up with a theory called general semantics. This is early 20th century. This isn't stuff that I'm coming up with on my own. I mean, I may have come to some of these conclusions on my own, but I got a lot of relief out of finding someone who made the same or a similar exploration. The quote that he's most famous for is, "The map is not the territory." Now, in some ways that seems obvious. If you take out a map of the New York subway system and put it down on the ground and stand on the map, it's not like you're going to be on the subway moving from point A to point B, right? But the corollary to his statement, "the map is not the territory," is if you conceive of the grand universal design being such that a map has been made at a scale of 1 to 1, we are not living in the territory, we're living in the map. It's the same size, if you need it to be the same size. The size of our body, the mass of our body, is the shape of our consciousness. It's a 1-to-1 relationship. But this being the territory is a false illusion. The territory is actually somewhere else. We're living in the map. And what I want to offer for anybody who thinks that's a little too strange or a little too metaphysical is that that's exactly what the cutting edge of physics is telling you right now. If we were living in the 19th century or the 18th century or back with Heraclitus and Parmenides, we might be able to argue over this. We might be able to use language and say, you know, that's bullshit. You spoke too much grass, whatever the case may be. But for anybody who understands the mathematics and the physics involved in what's going on at CERN, at the European Community's Particle Accelerator, which has just recently been built and just recently been fired up to these incredibly high energy levels that are beyond anything that human creativity has managed before. Essentially, subatomic particles are being accelerated and smashed into one another, and there are readings being made of the collisions that arise from these particles smashing into one another. And what they're learning is that most quantum theory is correct. It's not really about particles. Particle is a misnomer. It's really about energy existing in the universe in a flow, in a continuous flow, like music, like vibration. And when things vibrate with one another in a harmonious way, you get a different effect than if there's dissonance, if there's chaos, if there's conflict. So essentially, my reading of current physics is that it supports the idea that the map is not the territory. It supports the idea that comes up in the Zohar that we cannot, through our 5 senses, truly perceive reality. We are limited in terms of what's available to us. There are much deeper truths that are beyond our abilities cognitively. So, and again, forgive me, this is all by way of introduction, and maybe this is a cop-out, but the point I want to make here is that, again, there's no way that I can explain post-structuralism through language. There's a lot of people who get upset now in the political sphere, for instance, the whole Tea Party movement, because there are certain people that say, you just don't get it. Because when an argument arises, if someone is stuck in a verbal sphere where everything has to be understood cognitively and verbally, and the other person is saying, you know what, there's something that's beyond that, and I can't explain it to you if you can't allow yourself to experience it, then ultimately you're left in a place where one person says you just don't get it, and then the other person likely gets upset that they don't get it.
There's no common language.
There's no common language. Exactly, because language is part of the problem. Even if we wanted to do it in Esperanto, Esperanto too would have syntax rules and grammatic rules that would limit one's ability to understand something. Right? If we go back to Close Encounters of the Third Kind, for instance, the aliens didn't communicate through language. They communicated through a series of tones. Right? Pardon?
A language.
Okay, if we want to get into semiotics, any series of symbols, paroles, right? Paroles, right? Signs that have rules that we agree on is a language. And I'll agree to that. But that's not the way I'm using language for the purposes of this discussion. I think you and I could probably go down that road together, and maybe some other people would want to join in, but I think that gets a little bit esoteric.
By any chance, would you know who referred to music as the universal language?
I don't, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was Shakespeare, but I'm not saying it necessarily was. But
perhaps according to what you're saying, that would be an oxymoron, because music is antithesis, or
No. It's
music too. But
I think it's not an oxymoron, and it is a language the way John is using the word language. But I'm trying to use the word language in a more, in a less philosophical sense, and in a more pragmatic sense. I am using the English language right now to convey ideas to you, and I'm trying to convey that I am limited by the tools that the language offers me. Okay? So I want to bring up another Polish Alfred. Originally, his name was Teitelbaum. It got changed to Tarski, and he converted. Obviously, he was Jewish originally. He converted to Catholicism at one point, but he maintained throughout his whole life that he was an atheist. So, without speaking to him one-to-one, it's impossible to know for sure. But I think it's pretty clear that the implication is that he made the conversion at that point in history where it was a wise thing to do for your academic standing, for your social standing, to not be Jewish, to be Catholic, let's say. He, in a great many ways, also said things similar to what I'm saying. He spoke about a meta language. He spoke about the need for a new set of symbols and a new set of logical rules if you want to speak about language. You can't use the language, which is part of the problem, to explain or solve the problem. So now we get into these concepts of meta-language. Something, a set of rules that goes beyond the rules inherent in the problem itself.
We engage in, this is the very person we engage in now, explaining the language.
Right, okay. So I'm going to assume everybody essentially gets it, and we'll jump ahead a little bit. What I think is critical to understand in terms of the vanguard of contemporary philosophy and literary theory is that it's not that we live in a physical reality and that the physical reality has primacy. The cutting edge of literary theory says that we reify, and this actually in a lot of ways does go back to Feuerbach and Marx and Hegel. We reify, we make the future real, we make the physical real through our thoughts, through our consciousness. Everything begins with consciousness, everything begins with thought. And again, to me, this goes back to religion. This goes back to Bereshit. First, and I'm not trying to posit an omnipotent, omniscient God. I'm trying to understand Bereshit as a metaphor. But what's important for me in that metaphor is that the first act is of speaking. Saying something into being. Hashem, God, the creator, the creative energy of the universe. However you want to understand it, it spoke things into being. The thought, the consciousness preceded the physical reality, not the other way around. So it's our consciousness, it's our socialization that allows the physical to limit what we can perceive, what we can experience, what we can do, what we can accomplish. So what this leads me to is that the power of belief is real. And I want to separate the power of belief, the phenomenon of believing in something, from religious structures. Because I think in a lot of ways the history of religion and the history of psychology and the history of philosophy is creating structures cognitively, linguistically. Yeah?
No question for you.
Sure.
It might be a bit simplistic. So, in my ethics class, we talk about a famous case, a guy named Dax Coward.
Mhm.
Talk a little louder.
Sorry?
You talk a little louder.
Yeah. In my ethics class, I teach students about a famous case about a guy named Dax Cower, who was a burn victim in the mid-70s. And he kept asking the doctors to please let him die. The doctors refused, and they kept forcing skin grafts on him and dumping him into tanks full of Clorox-laced water that comes out his sores. And would you ever tell him that was all in his head?
No, I wouldn't.
If the physical is an expression simply of consciousness in the mind, that would be a good thing to tell him. You could relieve him of all of his pain.
Okay, sure. When you put it that way, absolutely. I would, because I'm not an expert at this, I would bring in the cognitive psychologists, the experts in meditation, and as many stand-up comics that I could find who could actually be funny in that kind of situation, and explain to him, listen, you have neural pathways, and you have the power through your consciousness to activate the natural painkillers in your brain. So rather than put you through this hell that these doctors did with every best intention, but as we know, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, right? The key is actually in his consciousness. Now, again, I don't know, once we go from being children in a pre-verbal state to living our childhood and then going through puberty and adolescence and becoming socialized and becoming young adults and adults, there's a tremendous amount of neural mapping that's gone on in the last 10 years or so, 20 years maybe, because the power of computers has become so great. That our ability to investigate the pleasure centers and the pain centers in the brain has become so acute that there's actually coming to be more and more evidence for the fact that this is true.
How would you interpret the fact he was ever burned in the first place?
Okay. How are you asking me to interface with that phenomenon, not having witnessed it?
But if the physical is really a derivative expression of consciousness,
Right.
why did his deepest part of his brain decide to be burned, as opposed to other people who were not?
I think you're using the language there to... it's not a question of literality for me.
Yeah.
I think you're giving a little too much power to... You use the word decide, and that's what I'm getting hung up on.
Gotcha.
Okay?
Gotcha.
I don't think the most self-destructive of us go out and decide we're going to get hit by a bus today, or that we're going to have a horrific chemical burn or be in a fire or something. Right? It's more a matter of, do we allow the physical mapping to limit our consciousness, or do we say, and I know you and I have talked about this word before, do we allow our consciousness to transcend that?
Yeah.
And the consciousness, having transcended those limits, can then work its way backwards. And I think that's what a tremendous amount of artists today are doing. That they allow their consciousness to go beyond the limits, beyond language.
Yeah.
They generally get to a place where there's commonality of understanding. People are grooving on the same vibe. And then they come back and they say, now how can I reify my experience for an audience that's somehow going to vibe with what I just experienced?
Okay.
Right? Okay.
One more quick question.
Sure.
If I understand correctly, and language only restricts what primordial experience affords us, the mystics and contemplatives of the world over who talk about non-conceptual kinds of experiences, why do they write so much?
That's a really good question. I think it used to be they would talk instead of writing, and I think that was much more dynamic. I think when the Torah was an oral Torah as opposed to a written Torah, we had less problems. I think today that it's written, we have more problems. But then you could make the argument that even talking is using the language.
Zen Buddhists, Hindus, Sufis, lots and lots, copious amounts of literature, libraries and libraries full of writing, special uses of language in order to sort of bring someone to a certain kind of experience. And that makes me think that the relationship of language and pre-conceptual experience is a bit more complex than people usually take it up.
Okay, and I think you're doing a tremendous amount of categorization that I'm not. Okay, like you used the word only a little bit earlier that I didn't quite have the chance to respond to. I think that's kind of an absolutist word. It's way out at the extremes. Only, never. you're using the word, decide to get burned. I think you're allowing language to kind of undress you in a way that shows that your cognitive patterns are really structured. They're really stuck in certain places where your inclination is to combat these ideas, try to find exceptions. For instance, I can give you a poem by Rumi, or I can give you a Zen koan, what is the sound of one hand clapping. I can give you a great many examples of these Eastern mystics, and forgive me if you don't like the word Eastern, using language not to try to lead you to a particular, as I think I heard you just say right there at the end, but rather to open your consciousness to the fact that no one can lead you there, that you have to allow yourself to be uprooted, to be vertiginous, to kind of feel ill at ease, and rather than be really sure and machmir about your opinions, to kind of say, wow, this is kind of a fog that I'm navigating in. I don't know where the limits are. I don't know where the edges are.
So to bring the rational mind to its frontier, to a wall, so we can go further.
I think the walls already exist as far as the rational mind goes, and the frontiers where they're undefined are only accessible by a mind that operates in both hemispheres, not just the left hemisphere, logical, analytical, rational, but both hemispheres working in unity. The intuitive, the feminine, as well as the masculine, logical, analytical, really concrete.
I don't want to hog up your talk, but
Okay.
I guess the only reason why I use the word decide is because I like the burn victim example, because I happen to have a different view that the world is something we live and suffer through, and that it's a good part of it is not mind created. In
Okay.
fact, if anything, a good part of our mental structures come from the world, not vice versa.
Okay, and what I want to offer without certainty is that it's actually our mentality that projects the real quote-unquote world as we perceive
Like
it.
being burned.
Yes, not choosing and not deciding, but and again, I don't want to take this down this detour necessarily, but the one thing that I want to offer is play devil's advocate for a moment.
Yeah.
Let's say that the existential crisis that Nietzsche suffered when he felt that he has always lived this same exact life over and over and over and over again was being suffered by this individual who was about to do something horrific.
Yeah.
And he somehow decided, to use your word, this time I'm going to interrupt it. And instead of killing all those people I was just about to kill, I'm going to burn myself.
Gotcha.
Okay? I don't think there's any way you can disprove that hypothesis in this particular example that you like to use, because that was a point of contention for us when you were presenting a few weeks ago, if you remember. Right. All right. So if I can get back to this. Okay. So to go back to the idea that the power of belief is real. In a lot of ways, this is what performance art is all about. And David Bowie, who's one of my favorite musicians, once offered a quote which I find both horrific and incredibly powerful at the same time. He said that Hitler was the greatest performance artist of all time. He performed an entire nation. Now, if you look at the linguistic construct of what he's saying there, he performed. In other words, he was the puppet master. He, through the use of language, through the tools of cognitive structures, convinced everybody to believe in his reality, and part and parcel of believing in that reality was genocide. Okay? So that's what I mean by the power of belief is real. Stalin is another example. The whole 20th century, and Charlie Manson, to use the same kind of impulse, but on a different scale. The whole 20th century is full of individuals living in a time where we have, in a lot of ways, come untethered from historical structures of ethics and morality, largely because of 19th century philosophical thought and inquiry, and the divorce of truth and meaning. And so people naturally are inclined to find something to replace that feeling of vertigo with. So when someone steps on the stage and offers a dramatic belief system, a dramatic structure, through which they can perform their most fascistic impulses, their most greedy impulses, however you want to put it, they're liable to clutch at that because that's much more satisfying than living in that fog of unsettled uncertainty as we navigate through this kind of miasma. And here I actually want to go back to Shakespeare very briefly. One of the greatest users of the tools of language, I think we'd agree. When he writes all the world's a stage, he's being literal. And in a lot of ways, he's foreshadowing Koszybski and the idea that the map is not the territory. He's saying we're all actors, we're all performers. We are all stuck in places where we're busy acting rather than being. We talk about being in love. We tell someone we love them instead of feeling it and expressing it and showing it. To say it is not the same as to express it. And I think in some ways that's what he's saying by all the world's a stage. So what I get out of that is that the concept of collective consciousness has validity. If the power of belief is real and a great many people believe in something, some concept, they can make that manifest in the physical world. Whether that's gas chambers and crematoria to dispose of human beings, the industrialization of murder, whether it's trauma centers and burn wards where we are constantly moving the ball forward in terms of easing pain and investigating everything that there is about the body and consciousness and the interface between the two. So that's the point there. Now, what I want to offer at this point is kind of a number of thinkers that I think are much less known than the people that most times when people inquire philosophically that they go to. You know, if you study political philosophy, Hobbes, Locke, Hume, John Stuart Mill, utilitarianism runs in that family. Hume eventually, I mean, Jeremy Bentham. There's a whole corpus of the people you've sort of got to read if you're studying political philosophy in an Anglo-Saxon environment. And I think there are actually a lot of things that are being presented by some of these thinkers that speak to the cutting edge of literary theory and philosophy, and most people are not terribly familiar with them. I want to start with Giorgio Agamben. He's an Italian, he's a contemporary, and he has spoken of three concepts which I think are critical. One is whatever singularity, and I want to take those two words separately. He uses the word whatever, not the way we tend to use the word whatever. You know, whatever, like, whatever mom, or my teacher wants me to redo my essay or redo my midterm, you know, whatever. It's not a use of the word to denigrate the concept behind it. It's actually the exact opposite. And it makes sense in Latin, and remember, Italian being a Romance language, and in lots of ways having cognates with Latin, it makes sense that he would use this concept of whatever to specify rather than generalize. We tend to use the word whatever to mean like generally, right? Oh, whatever, it's all the same. It doesn't really have any meaning. It's all relative, right? Whereas Agamben is using whatever to specify. Whatever that singularity may be, it is going to be thus and so. Now, the concept of singularity is something that's also very contemporary. Moore's theorem, which has now essentially been proven as his law, is, and this is really very young, but in some ways things that came out of the 60s and 70s are already ancient. The computational power of the microchip increases exponentially, not additively. It's asymptotically. As the curve gets steeper, it goes up almost in a vertical line, almost straight. So now we have Time magazine, we have popular publications, periodicals, postulating that by the year 2045 we will be wet wired. Does anybody know what I mean by that? wet wired, okay, that we will have a physical interface between our bodies, between our nervous system, I'm assuming our naturally occurring nervous systems, which exist through the language of DNA. We will have an interface with computers, okay? So whether it's going to be that little soft spot behind your ear where your mandible, where your jaw and the rest of your skull meet, where actually you could put wires in and hook a little thumb drive up to it, whatever the case may be, it's not something that's just science fiction anymore. We're within a generation or two of having the technology to connect to computers. Yeah.
Just like you said, we have that now in terms of those pacemakers.
Sure. And veterans who come back to war, who have artificial limbs, who learn how to use these limbs. Absolutely. The one differentiation I'd like to make is we're not just talking about the electronic as a physical tool to augment or replace elements of the body. We're talking about connecting to it at the cognitive level, where there's a flow back and forth between the information that is, quote unquote, within us as physical beings and out there. On servers, if you're doing the Sun Microsystems and Larry Ellison's Oracle model, or in the cloud if you're using the Google model. But the point is that there's a constant interface between the physical, seemingly individual body and all that electronic data. Okay? That's not just a science fiction concept anymore. That's the direction. So when Agamben talks about the singularity, he's talking about a moment in time, in the continuity of time, which will be a new historical reality, a new historical phenomenon, where our collective consciousness goes beyond being something theoretical, beyond being something that we have ideas about and discuss philosophically, and it becomes real. Through the use of computers, linked to one another, we truly have a collective consciousness that we're, maybe not all of us, but that we are physically linked into. Okay? So that's the concept of whatever singularity. He doesn't know when that moment will be. He doesn't know exactly what it looks like, but he does feel it's inevitable, which for a lot of people is very pessimistic, very horrific in other ways. It's the end of humanity in certain conceptual frameworks. But he says it's inevitable, and I think a great many other people would argue that it is inevitable. So whatever that singularity is, the coming community is not community the way we've always understood it till now. It is a manifestation of that collective consciousness. We are all going to be changed in terms of what we seem to be as individuals by what it means to be a community, what it means to be communal in that collective consciousness future. Okay? And the third concept he brings up that I think is really phenomenal and brilliant also goes back to Latin. It's homo sacer. And this concept is back in ancient Roman Greco times, there was this idea that an individual could be sacrificed for the sins of the community. Okay? And if someone was particularly heinous within the community, they became homo sacer, which means you could murder them. Anybody could murder them without threat of punishment, without threat of the state acting against them for the crime of murder, but they could not be sacrificed. In other words, they are now tame. They did something so abhorrent to the community that they cannot be used as a sacrifice. All sorts of other people can be sacrificed on behalf of the community, essentially to be a scapegoat, but this individual cannot. But he can be killed. They can be killed. Okay? And so this concept of
What is the difference? One second. You cannot be sacrificed, but can be. It's not the same.
It's not the same. To the dead person, absolutely it's the same. I'm not trying to argue that it's a differentiation to the victim. The act of making a sacrifice is a communal act. Let's take the religion out of it for a second. It's a communal act. Whether it's to sacrifice an individual for the sins of the community or not, any kind of sacrifice is a communal act. There is a belief, shared belief by more than one individual, that giving up voluntarily giving something up, not using it, not allowing yourself the best of something, okay, that will appease the gods, that there is a benefit to be gained from sacrifice. Okay? Now, to take it out of the Western religion for a second, there were indigenous people to this continent in the Northwest, in the Pacific Northwest, the Potlatch tribe. Okay? And this people had a belief system that said that you gain by giving. There was a movie made recently along these lines called Pay It Forward. Right? The measure of wealth is not how much you amass, how much you take, how much you own, how much you have. The measure of wealth in that community was how much you will give away. Now, one can argue you can't give away unless you take first, but I think we're splitting hairs at that point. The fact of the matter is that if the poorest person in the community at any given moment in time was the richest 15 minutes ago, but then they gave everything away, the fact is that in this moment, they're a pauper. They've given everything away. Okay? So I'm saying again, this is a cognitive structure, this is a cognitive map that inverts, subverts the way we tend to think about things like wealth, power, things like that. So the point I want to make about Agamben here that I think is really important is that ultimately he's an anarchist. He's saying that the power in the state is not only illusory and illegitimate, which any anarchist will agree with. He goes farther to postulate that we cannot be truly human until we evolve beyond the need for laws, beyond the need for state structures to regulate our behavior. We're living in a pre-human reality for Agamben. And he's very pessimistic if he says that the direction that the future is going into is one where the collective consciousness, where we have evolved to the point where we can reify collective consciousness through machines, but we have not yet evolved as humans to the point that we don't need laws anymore in order to treat each other decently. I think, in this way, Agamben is a natural descendant of Hannah Arendt. When she writes post-Holocaust and contemporaneous with the Soviet Union about fascism and totalitarianism, she's saying that these state manifestations, these state structures, reflect the collective consciousness of the individuals within them. As long as the way that we behave towards one another at the individual level has aspects of fascism in it, domination, control, force, imprinting conviction, rather than being comfortable with a more relativistic, with a more live and let live, with a more we can agree to disagree kind of position, we cannot move forward as humans if we're stuck in places where it's all about the power structures, where every conversation is about, there was a great Seinfeld episode about relationships and who has hand in the relationship. Who has the upper hand, who has the whip hand, to use a jockey term from horse racing. Okay? And my take on this is to go a step beyond Hannah Arendt. I think a great deal of contemporary art, visual performance written, deals with the body and sexuality. It's coming to be called biopolitics. Whether it's about piercings or tattooings or even, for that matter, abortion rights. It's about reifying the rights of the individual to have dominion over their body in the legal sphere. Okay? And if you think about how new an argument this really is, I think it gives validity, it gives credence to the idea that throughout history, it really has been the consciousness that comes first. The physical comes second. The idea that any individual woman has the right to decide whether or not to terminate a pregnancy, something that has to do with a life other than her own, that's physically taking place within the confines of her body. This is something that's being argued right now, today. That's how far or how not far we've come, that this is where the discourse is. And one other person that has influenced my thought that I want to bring up here is Wilhelm Reich. This is not a name that's familiar to a lot of people. He was a psychoanalyst, psychologist, psychiatrist, however you want to refer to him. He was contemporary to Einstein. And as far as I know, to this day, he is still the only instance of censorship in America. The Food and Drug Administration, in conjunction with the FBI, burned his notebooks, destroyed a tremendous amount of the work that he did. So, in the 50s, I believe, late 40s, early 50s. Now, okay, it's almost certain that he was at least a little bit of a crackpot. Whether he had a nervous breakdown late in his life or not. Pardon?
His late life, he was a crackpot.
Okay.
He built cloud-busting machines and boxes called orgone boxes that have no scientific reality. If you want to see them in Aquasic, Maine, it's his house and his library. But
yeah.
His early work on character armor is still highly regarded in psychology, but his late stuff, let's just say, he went off the deep end.
Okay, and I happen to think that there was a continuity and an arc to his narrative, the story of his life, that I wouldn't go so far as to say that he went off the deep end. I'm aware of orgone accumulators and the Orgone Museum in Maine, but I would make the argument that actually he was onto something. Whether he went off the deep end, as you say, or not, and I'm not totally opposed to the idea that he did, and that's why I said, let's face it, he was at least a little bit of a crackpot. There was definitely some creeping paranoia to some of his writings late, but you got to remember, he was incarcerated. The government really was out to get him. Can you be paranoid if they really are out to get you? Let me analogize just very briefly. For everybody who has a cell phone, you know, they're ubiquitous. We rely on them. They work, except for on the subway. But if you go back 200 years before Bell, the whole idea of the Morse code and the telegraph and the telephone would have been considered science fiction. And if you go back 20, maybe 30 years, the idea that we could communicate at this level wirelessly without being connected would have been science fiction. So I think there's something to the idea that there are all these waves, these impulses, these energies that are invisible to us, that are beyond our cognitive sensory perception. They're real. They exist. Radio waves, right? I mean, this is patently true. Nobody's going to want to argue about this, right? Okay? So now what Reich did is he said that the power of orgasm in the human body is an electrical phenomenon. There's something going on in our nervous system that you can understand the same way you can understand the circuits that exist in a computer. Right? So there's a tremendous amount of dysfunction when that sexuality doesn't work. And what I want to postulate is, to go back to Marx briefly, when Marx talks about fetishism, when he talks about the alienation of labor, when he talks about capitalism as having certain structures that are inherently impossible to overcome as long as there's alienation of labor, I think this is what he's talking about. I think that there are natural impulses, natural electric orgone, if you will, if you're not so quick to say that Reich went off the deep end, circuits in our body that we need to have replenished, that we need to have operating in healthy, functional ways. And in the highly westernized, industrialized, materialistic world where there's alienation of labor, these circuits can't be completed properly. And this manifests itself in things like alcoholism, drug abuse, gambling addictions, shopping addictions, people being workaholics. All these ways in which we cannot reify our emotional connections, our emotional relationships, because we're subject to this fetishism of the material. We obsess about having more things, or we obsess about status, or we, whatever. I think some of this is a little pedestrian. I think people, right, generally get, okay. So, I want to wrap it up. I hope I'm not boring everybody.
What are these orgone accumulators?
Okay, so Reich was convinced that this energy, kind of the same way that if you build a power plant and you have electrical transmission wires, electricity kind of bleeds out into the air from these wires. It's not 100% conductivity, okay? So essentially, he theorized that in the moment of orgasm, you have a release of electrical energy, and that if you do this within a box, then the box can accumulate and measure how much more electricity there is following a subject going through this experiment rather than existed in the box beforehand. Okay?
And I mean, did they ever do that?
Well, he tried. Whether or not he came up with results that are legitimate is very much open to debate.
Did they have any results?
Yeah, he had tons of results, but again, a great deal of his research was destroyed by the government,
But
and
the
a
US
great deal of it
government?
is questionable. Pardon?
The U.S. government?
The U.S. government, the Food and Drug Administration in conjunction with the FBI. Yeah, and it's, as far as I know, it's still the only...
That's the fact, they destroyed it?
Yeah.
Well, what business do they have to destroy for private
Okay,
research?
all very good questions, and I'd be happy to engage in that discussion, but I really want to wrap it up because I don't want to overdo it with everybody. I want to bring up just a couple of other names. Emil Durkheim, who I think is familiar to most people, along with Max Weber, really the beginnings of sociology, the beginnings of trying to understand the way we socialize from a scientific point of view rather than just having it be something that happens without being studied. His conception, and the title of his work was Division of Labor in Society. So again, in some ways, he's paralleling Marx. He's talking about the fact that we allow ourselves to become specialized cogs in the highly industrialized world. To him speaks of something that's dis-ease. It makes us ill at ease. It's the beginning of being dysfunctional as humans, the beginning of no longer being human. Because instead of being able to engage with our work in a fulfilling, self-actualizing way, we wind up becoming dehumanized in subjecting ourselves to something greater, and that thing greater isn't necessarily something that benefits us as humans. So he postulated that all humans are essentially egoistic to begin with, but that again it's that collective consciousness that acts as a moralizing direction, as a moralizing normative force. Now contrast that very briefly with Freud, who postulated the ego, the superego, and the id as being three very different impulses within the individual. Okay? The superego is like our conscience. The ego just wants to do what it wants to do. It's very childish and just, point and grab, like we do with the mouse with computer interface now. The superego kind of prevents us from doing that. It's that voice we allow in our head that says, no, because the consequences will be greater than the reward that you grab in this immediate gratification. So Durkheim is tremendously important for me because in the other work that I that I pointed to in the outline, The Elementary Forms of Religious Life, he talks about religion as a socially cohesive force. And what I take out of Durkheim is not that he so much believes in a pre-existing God, but he says that it's incumbent upon us to reify the concept of God. It's not that God made us, it's that we make God. So he's not so much arguing with Nietzsche. When Nietzsche says God is dead, Durkheim isn't saying, the t-shirt that now says Nietzsche is dead, God, right? Durkheim is saying, yeah, of course God is dead. God has always been dead. This childish concept of God has never existed, because it's up to us to create that, to create a force where our collective consciousness drives us in a direction for good rather than in a direction that just seeks to satisfy our material whims or our momentary need for creature comforts. Someone else that I want to add quickly, Theodosius Dobzhansky. This is Ukrainian or Russian, I actually don't remember at the moment, but he was of the Eastern Orthodox Church rather than Catholic or Protestant or Jewish or Muslim. And there are some significant differences between the churches of the Orthodoxy focused on Istanbul when there was a split in the Christian church rather than focused on Rome. This is the guy who came up with modern evolutionary synthesis. This is an incredibly important theory that augments Darwinism. He was a biologist by training. So he's very much a scientist, very much a rationalist. But throughout his entire life, he considered himself a man of God, a religious person. Okay? So I think it's very important to conceptualize, when you look at people like Dobzhansky and look at people like Durkheim, who are both considered scientists, but in tremendously different fields. Sociology and biology, tremendously different. And yet still they're both dealing with concepts of the divine and concepts of some kind of collective consciousness beyond our individual consciousnesses. And there's just one last, actually two. Lev Vygotsky and the idea of cultural historical psychology. I think he comes up with a brilliant observation about the West largely, which he felt had split itself into a false dichotomy between the objectivism of behaviorism, the false objectivism of behaviorism, and he was a cognitive psychologist. Okay, so if anybody knows about B.F. Skinner or Skinner boxes, the idea that we're all rats in a maze, we're socialized through behavior. Okay? Vygotsky's take is the idea that you can be objective and study individual humans' behavior is false. You cannot be completely objective. No matter whether it's a single blind, a double blind, a triple blind study, it's still not going to be absolutely objective. You can't achieve it. And he felt that the other false construct predominant in the West was the subjectivism of introspective psychology of people like William James. So the concept of cultural historical psychology is tremendously different and worth studying, and I'll be happy to talk about it if anybody wants to go there, but I want to add one more and then wrap it up. So the last guy that I want to cite is Slavoj Žižek. He's a contemporary. He hangs out with the guy from WikiLeaks, who's Julian Assange, and Lady Gaga. Okay? So in lots of ways, we're really talking about, we're not talking about like Heraclitus and Parmenides in 19th century philosophy or early 20th century philosophy. We're talking about the philosophy of this moment, what's going on with one of the leading performance artists of the world and one of the leading contemporary philosophical thinkers. To me, he's a performance artist / philosopher. He's not a philosopher in the traditional sense or a philosophy professor in the traditional sense. He's doing performance art. He's essentially reifying his theories by being bombastic, by being hard to take and difficult in some ways to understand and seemingly contradicting himself because he wants to get under your skin. Because he's saying essentially you live in a bourgeois mentality, you live in structures that are false, and it is those structures that allow human suffering to continue. Okay? There was early 20th century German theater. There was this concept of offending the audience. I don't remember right now whether this is Bertolt Brecht or someone else. But it's the idea that when all these petits bourgeois come into the theater to be entertained, fuck them. Fuck that. Fuck entertaining the beasts. Get in their face and tell them the way you live your whole life, except for when you're coming for entertainment, is wrong. It's hurting people. It's fascistic. So we're not going to be here to entertain you. We're going to be here to get in your face. Okay? And I would say, in a lot of ways, that is also the world we live in. That we go to television, we go to the web, we go to films, we go to lots of different things to relieve our anxieties of a lot of these things like these feelings of, like the alienation of labor. And so Žižek is really in the right place. He's speaking exactly to the things that need to be said. That if you stick to structures that are illusory and false to begin with, you're not going to allow your mind to go to the places it needs to go for us to have a human collective consciousness as opposed to that coming singularity where we interface with machines in a way that winds up preventing us from ever getting in touch or staying in touch with our humanity.
Communicating with people.
Excuse me?
Just communicating with people. You can.
Yeah, communicating at a real level, at an emotional level rather than a linguistic level. Yeah, communication of the gut rather than of purely of the mind. Yeah. So my one and only objection really to Žižek is that he's an atheist, a total atheist, and I think this is partly the problem with again, the vanguard of philosophy and literary theory right now. The 20th century is a canvas on which atheistic philosophies and political systems have allowed themselves to be painted, and it's just a horrific painting. It's horror. So even if God doesn't exist, even if we have to build God, even if we have to do a Jedi mind trick on ourselves to postulate some beneficent being, it is in our best interest to do that. It's in our best interest to go along with the illusion, not as a pacifier, not blindly. The analogy that I made for a friend last weekend was religion previous to the Enlightenment is the Titanic. We humans build this, or we're part of this huge structure that can withstand anything. We're on the ship together. And if you are one of those persons in your thinking who goes over to the rail and looks out at the endless sea and says, oh my, this huge ship, actually it's so tiny when you look at the endless sea. And if you find that disquieting, maybe you go inside and you listen to the piano and the music and everybody having a good time at a party indoors in the Titanic. Okay? The Enlightenment is the iceberg. So the Titanic is religion, and the Enlightenment is the iceberg that sank religion. Now, in the contemporary paradigm, we're all in the water, we're on lifeboats, but the Titanic doesn't exist anymore. And what I'm saying is, those of us who find ourselves on the lifeboats, if we're sharing the lifeboat with one of the musicians who starts singing, or if they manage to salvage a violin, who starts playing the music that they were playing indoors while we were on the Titanic, partying before we ran into the iceberg, it feels good to sing along. Once you've gone through the experience of this great ship of structured religion hitting the Enlightenment and everybody having to... Not everybody. A lot of people bury themselves in the pacification of, we're going to go through the rituals, we're going to do everything the way they did in the 18th century, in the 16th century, in the 14th century, right? That's not the kind of Jedi mind trick that I'm talking about. When you're in the lifeboat, after the collision of the Enlightenment and religion, it still feels good, and there's something beneficial from allowing oneself to feel those feelings of the potential of that coming community, that whatever singularity, being positive rather than dehumanizing. That's it. Yeah.
The defense of religion as being utilitarian sounds a little bit not defensive.
Philosophically,
Well,
theologically.
It's not defensible, and then what's wrong with belief in man, the goodness of man?
I think the 20th century is what's wrong with that. I think the 20th century is proof that if you believe in a man or woman, it doesn't work out well.
True, but I think...
But I don't mean to...
In the small run, in the long run, we have to believe in man, we shouldn't believe in man.
I don't think it's a good idea. But I don't mean to try to denigrate religion or to imply that it can only be utilitarian. I'm trying to use the lifeboat analogy, and perhaps it fails as a metaphor, as a constructive or useful metaphor. But I'm not trying to reduce religion to just something utilitarian. I'm saying those feelings in themselves are also potentially mystical. There are things that we cannot conceive of unless we're going through some of those feelings as a community, and trying to reduce that concept to something that's just about utilitarianism is not what I mean.
But I think some of those feelings are social feelings,
Yes.
which has nothing to do with religion, it's just being part of a group, of having fellowship. This can be religion, it can be a political party or something else. This is the idea of fellowship.
Yeah, I don't think that the idea of fellowship, again, I often have a hard time when I hear really extreme language. I don't think it has nothing to do with religion. I think philosophy, psychology, religion, psyche in Greek means spirit. Okay, so that's kind of analogous to our use of the word soul. So these philosophical inquiries, psychological inquiries, this metacognition, thinking about thinking, feeling about what's going on in me as opposed to in the outside world. This has been part of the human experience, going back to the first caveman who drew about a buffalo hunt on the wall. I mean, that's a form of communication. It's a need for someone to take from inside and present to the community for fellowship. into the external, to reify in the external. I don't think you can divorce the word religion from that.
I'm just curious, what did you want us to take away from your talk?
Number one, that all structures are false and illusory. And
How about that structure?
that's not a structure.
It's a position. So there's some structure to the idea that what you're saying.
Yeah, it's a
like somebody
supposition.
says-
I think it's a supposition more than a
somebody says
position.
there's no
No,
truth.
I
Well, is that
think
true?
ultimately, it was true high-speed postmodernity, it deconstructed so falsehood and the opposites of falsehood and truth are
Right.
also debunked. Right? There just spent a lot of time working apart, daughter and father, right? Working
Right.
apart. So daughter is not brother, father is not.
Yeah.
Ultimately, there's a lot of wishful thinking in that sort of thing because a real deconstructionist could deconstruct it to hell.
Yes.
The whole thing. But,
I just don't enjoy that, so I don't.
Yeah, right. We have to stop somewhere, right?
Yes.
So
Yes.
in terms of conditioning, or in terms of social conditioning, right? So that gets all tricky. Because then you have to go back to 19th century, and you have to recognize Rousseau, and you have to recognize certain people and certain needs, like you said, of camaraderie, and that sort of it's a move away from Agamben already because his anarchic dream that everyone's independent, right? You can't rely on. And philosophically, also you can't rely on for a very good reason.
Right.
Because the problem with this whole approach, the biggest problem is the problem of ethics. It's a practical problem. Philosophically, the problem is that, as you say, you use the word shared will or common will. Right? So common will essentially relies on language because it's communicated. In a deeper way, it relies on reality. How do I know this true exists? Right? So I can't really know this true exists because I perceive it such and such. Right? So that's when I speak about it, maybe it exists. When I'm imagining it exists, someone else imagines it from a different.
And therefore, it's a different chair.
It's a different chair, right?
Right.
So that's already Berkeley, and now postmoderns really cracked it up, like pi is different in New Zealand and stuff like that. Right? But yet we're able to talk about it. We're able to talk about it because we can, like Wittgenstein said, we can point, language could point to the church, and because we have similar concepts, similar experiences, I may have not the same, right? So reality is forget, but we're still dealing with the problem of appearance, right?
Right.
So
the
we can only talk about ethics. My point is we can only talk about ethics if we communicate through language, not through through language, we communicate about universals, right? So that you can't get away from Plato. You can't get away from the you gotta
or Heraclitus and Parmenides. Ultimately,
otherwise you work yourself into a fistic frenzy.
Yes.
But if the concrete is just a reification of mind.
If what?
If the concrete facet of our experience is just a reification of mind,
right?
Then how do cultures of different languages ever first begin to understand one another?
Right.
Because according to you, they have to have shared experiences.
Right.
But
No,
shared
they don't have to share similar. They don't have to have shared experiences. They have the power of language after Wittgenstein. The language points to something.
Yes.
I have similar experience looking at this church. Similar. And
Similar enough that we can reach communication.
Enough, and will always know it's the same.
But how does your position not fall back into all the problems of subjective idealism? The idea is, if his world is in his mind and mine's in mine, how do we ever meet up in the same world?
See, I think that's what we're struggling with to try to communicate with you. You're not presenting arguments that are illegitimate, and we're not trying to characterize them as being illegitimate. Okay? You, I think, and forgive me if I'm wrong in this and putting words in your mouth in any way. You're creating dualities. You're creating either/or situations, right? In some ways, you're arguing in the extreme and to points of absurdity. If the world is in his mind, and the world in my mind is completely different, right? That's not what we're saying. There is an individual phenomenon, there's an individual experience of reality, and then there's a shared space. Okay? And things are not black and white. There are some grays and there are shadings of gray.
Okay, I accept that. So, just seeing that the language you were using was too extreme for me, and saying that concrete material is a product of the mental, or a reification of it. Whereas, I want to say, no, there is such a thing as a common sense world. There is a preconceptual, shared, but textured, but not completely mind-created world that we all share before.
Sure. This room was created by someone's mind. All architecture is the reification of physical space. Okay, so it might not have been you and him. It might not have been you and him who imagined and then reified the chairs on which you're sitting. But ultimately, it was a human mind who designed the chair and humans who built the chair and reified.
But the human mind that built the room, were they aware of the let's say, the impact that nice open spaces have on our minds? When I walk into a Zendo, I'm struck by the open space, the wooden floor, the bare white walls.
Any room that you walk into that's a minimalist room is a completely different frame of mind in its conception and in its reification than the Western clutter, umgepatchkit.
Gotcha, but the people that made that minimalist room, they had to draw upon certain facets of experience that they didn't create. Right.
They individually didn't.
Gotcha.
But the argument is that culture has power. So the historical imperative and the historical materialism of the flow of cultural ideas, memes,
but it's
signs, they all have validity and power.
It's not obvious to me which comes first. I think, if anything, the cultures of the world, in a way, they wean out different cross-sections of experience that are independent of any particular culture.
Okay,
And
I think to a post-structuralist, it's not important even to ask the question what came first. It's important to embrace the reality of the contemporary moment, right? It's a structuralist way of thinking to say that what we were just talking about begs the question, what came first? And a post-structuralist would say, that's really not important. It's not about black and white. It's not about what came first. It's not about somehow conceptualizing the whole, how did it start? It's about the need for a shared ethic, the need for going beyond the recent history of...
Where I differ, where I depart, I just think I've heard too much of how the physical in some level is a sort of an expression, manifestation of the mental, and I have...
How is it not?
I think it's a much more symbiotic, complex relationship that, in a way, even our innermost, even the spiritual experience of mystic in some way draws upon this particular body as a surface of the world. No one would have appreciated Plotinus, who has such an influence on Gnosticism and Kabbalah and Sufism, etc., says that no, the world of multiplicity and difference can be overcome by returning to some pristine unity. That language would make no sense to us spiritually if we were gas clouds floating over Mars with intelligence. It requires that body, the world we suffer through as an organism, and that preceded, if anything. I mean, so look, my point, all I'm saying is there is a world that we live in and suffer through that also plays a role, even in our most rarefied mental constructions.
John, to have you say that it's a give and take, that it's both,
yes, of course,
so surprises me that in and of itself makes this evening satisfying to me.
Okay, there you have it.
Ruth, you've been trying to say or ask something for a little bit. I'm sorry. Do you mind moving a little closer or speaking up? I can't hear you.
Structures are false and illuminating, and I don't think specifically. There's some interesting Kabbalist commentaries to support and to refute that idea. The idea, what you mean by false? It's a very unusual use of the word false. Illusory, I understand you're supposed to say structures, think about as they seem.
Okay,
if you're looking for a need for shared ethic,
I'm sorry?
But you said the other thing about a need for a shared ethic, that's a form of a structure, like a vessel, and not falsehood is really isn't falsehood, and when I'm talking about truth or falsehood, it's a whole different area of their structure, and whether you're talking about understanding or you're talking about physical things, you're kind of asking for a certain kind of metaphoric, conceptual structure. When you're talking to people, you want people to be aware of the fact that they're not like a concept.
Yeah, the analogy. Sure. I don't want to get into a semantic argument about the word false and how I might have meant it and how you might have taken it. Though I might be willing to engage in that individually if you really want. I think that's kind of beside the point. The analogy that works for me is when someone is training to be a high wire artist or a trapeze artist, it's probably a good idea that they train with a net, right? Because they're just learning and they're going to make mistakes and they need to learn how to do it without being terrified all the time that they're going to kill themselves or break their neck, okay? But I use the word false vis-a-vis structure because to me, there's a tremendous difference when it comes to performance time between the high wire artist or the trapeze artist who performs for the audience without a net and the one who performs with a net. Okay? Now you might argue that what they're doing physically up there is exactly the same. The net makes no difference. And I'm saying that the net makes a world of difference conceptually. And what I'm saying, pardon me?
Conceptually, structurally it makes a difference because the structure is they might kill themselves.
Yeah, now you're losing me. You're losing me in the metaphor. The point I want to make, Ruth, is that when I say that structure is false, when I use the word false, is those of us who insist on having the net are believing in structures that don't actually exist. That's why I use the word false. Not just illusory, false.
They really would probably die if they fall and there's no net.
And now we're definitely losing ourselves in the metaphor. We could take this up individually, but
You know, in yeshivas, there's a law in the Talmud that says the sukkah has to have 4 walls, 3 walls.
3 walls, right.
Right, so the wall has to be a wall. Now what happens if there's a gap in the wall that's more than 3 tefachim, 3 feet? Right? So the Gemara says we'll look at it as if it's a wall, it's a law.
Right.
So the famous yeshivish joke is really the standard interpretation is that because it's a hole, but because the Gemara strike with defining legal language, as far as the Jewish law looks at it, it's a wall, unbreached wall. Legally, this is not considered a hole.
Right.
In reality, it is. So the famous joke in Shivas, where she sits in the sukkah and the cat walks in. And there was a big gap, 3 feet like that. The cat's big, so she freaks out. Says, I don't understand, it's a law. Right. So he's general semantics. He's right.
Yeah.
Either the Rosh Yeshivas were pioneers of general semantics. Right. This is right. But on the serious note, that wasn't a problem because how did that can get according to this metaphorically can the cat get it?
Right.
Can the cat get it? Meaning, can we create ethics with this, or is it meaningful? Can this shift occur in a person's lifetime? Right? That's the big question. The changing of narrative, can we think ourselves up faster? Or is this a long historical process? If it is, then it's tough.
I think we don't have any choice but to assume that we can and act as if we can, even if it turns out to be a false optimism. Otherwise, we're doomed, right? Otherwise, you may as well commit suicide. Yeah, I mean, really, that's the dead end that we are on the precipice of. So you have to believe, you have to act as if. Even if all evidence is to the contrary, you have to act as if it is possible to work ourselves out of that dead end in time. Yeah, the sukkah is actually...
You can't results. You should, therefore you can.
Right. The idea of the sukkah, I think, is a phenomenal metaphor here. Okay? Judaism offers the reification of the concept of post-structuralism thousands of years before the idea of structuralism and the need for deconstructing structuralism came along. Okay? We have a yearly reminder of the fact that the structures are... Right. Another reason for the argument for religion. Yes.
I saw you as prioritizing language and as mediating things. I saw you as more of a pragmatist, seeing the burn victim or the object, reality can be separate in some way from language. My concern with post-structuralism, if you believe that there's slippage between the referent and the word, that it becomes intertwined with relativism. And Derrida, late in his career, turned to ethics. I think it's probably because of Levinas' influence. I'm not sure. Yeah, that's right. In Judaism, that's right. At the last. So the problem I have, there are different types of relativism, ethical, but how do you distinguish your view about things being in the mind and these structures that create from, I guess, the genocide? You brought up the big the big ethical question. Can you differentiate relativism from your post-structuralism?
I don't think I can. I want to clarify one thing.
Yeah.
When I spoke about language, I didn't mean to make it the central thesis of what I wanted to get across. I wanted to, and again, some people would consider this a cop-out because you're essentially saying, okay, I'm about to use language to explain my ideas, but the language is itself incapable of explaining my ideas, so you can't, corner me on this because you're going to use language to try to corner me and the language doesn't work, right? I'm just trying to convey for people who have not been steeped in that philosophical tea kettle, right, that there are elements to communication that are problematic just in the structures okay. But now, to me, relativism is a phenomenon that cannot be separated from post-structuralism. You could not have gotten to post-structuralism without relativism having been part of the journey to get there. And I don't have a problem with that. And I don't have a problem with moral relativists exercising moral relativism. I just have a problem with them exercising it on me. So what I'm saying is that in the mass culture in which we live, and the mass structures in which we live, the state to which we choose to voluntarily subject ourselves because we really don't have tremendous alternatives, there are flaws that I think the only way to... Great, yeah. The only way to supersede some of those flaws is to create those communities intentionally within the false structures of the whole. Okay? So if we're going to get into ethical questions, the idea is not to get to a shared understanding of what's a proper ethical solution and imprint that at the state level. Right? The idea is to say, okay, this is how we get beyond moral relativism. This is how we agree communally on a shared ethics.
Like a kibbutz.
Like a kibbutz, exactly. But let's not get into the economic failings of the kibbutz. I mean, let's do kibbutz Brooklyn. Okay? There are reasons why the kibbutz system failed in Israel, but it doesn't mean the concept of commune, right, is necessarily flawed. Okay? So, but that's exactly what I'm talking
Ground
about.
up, not top down.
Yes. Yes. We need to go beyond think globally and act locally. We got to get to the point where we're thinking locally and acting locally, because the global is too out of control.
How come philosophically, a person with a philosophical bent doesn't want to discuss ideology?
You hear one time?
Why do you not want to address the false phenomenon? I'm thinking, if we use the word false for things that are, when what we really mean is not fully understood or not well understood, or perhaps something that would have to be understood in such a myriad of ways to now qualify as understanding. But isn't that's different?
No, I'm using the word false intentionally. To me, the word false has a connotation of being a lie. It's not just illusory, it's intentionally a lie. That's why I use the word false. Okay? The capitalist materialist structure is intentionally false. Advertising intentionally doesn't try to make you feel good. It tries to make you feel bad about yourself, so you'll buy a product to alleviate that anxiety. That's not just illusory, right? That's falsehood.
But there are specific falsehoods in what's being presented. It's not because it's a structure.
I'm sorry, there's specific falsehoods in what?
Because there's a structure. It's false because they're misrepresented.
Yeah, but it's the structure that allows the misrepresentation to become reified. Okay? If there's no structure, then the advertising works on you to create an anxiety where you don't feel good about yourself, but you don't run to the drugstore to buy something from the cosmetic counter. The structure of the consumerist mentality and the materialist mentality allows you to channel those feelings of disquiet and dis-ease and anxiety that are advertising provoked and advertising driven into alleviating that anxiety by spending capital, by spending money.
I totally agree with you that that's an important problem.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's a false structure.
What I'd like to be clear is the process of being able to use our minds to test things out, which is to me what part of the idea of falseness comes from when you test things out.
Part of the idea
of falseness is to test things out and you see, oh, this is a lie.
Okay.
It's part of, we need that skill to be able to build with more ethical economies.
Sure,
You know,
absolutely.
they'll have problems too, but we need to have that testable thing. And the line in the example you gave is that one that we would be happier if we buy up their craft. You know, that's a lie. And the lie of them telling us so many reasons why we need it. There are a lot of specifics.
I'm sorry, I keep not being able to hear. Anybody, can we break this up? Everybody good? Yeah? Okay, thank you. Thank you. So I'll have some wine.
Daniel, you're a good speaker.
Thank you, John. Thank you.
Capitalism is what screws everything up. Everyone's out for themselves.
think so.
It's become very selfish.
I think it's part of it. I don't think it's only. I think it's part of it.
Very big.